It is a great honor to have this opportunity to share some of my ideas about Diego Velázquez at the Prado. He is an artist from whom I have learned so much over so many years. It's wonderful to be able to share some of these ideas here today. In that context, I would like to thank my distinguished colleagues from the Museo del Prado for this invitation. And I would also like to add my sincere appreciation for all of the work of the staff of the Fundación de Amigos del Prado, especially Susana Maraval and Alberto Pancorbo, because they did so much to ensure that this lecture can take place as planned, even at a distance. 2020 was a year of tremendous challenges for the entire world. And yet, if this series of lectures proves anything, it is the importance of art and ideas, even at times when they seem so secondary to more immediate needs. For art renews our sense of wonder, helps us see the deeper meaning of being, especially in periods like this, and reminds us of everything that connects us to one another, whether as people who speak different languages, come from different cultures today, or with those people who lived in the past and left their traces through the paintings I will be talking about today. Like most European courts in the 16th and the 17th centuries, the one presided over by Philip IV included an array of fools, ranging from innocent simpletons to clever buffoons and jesters. Many of these human oddities were secured from various parts of the Iberian Peninsula. There was also active exchange throughout Europe with collectors in many other countries. Some of these beings could be sent as gifts or would be sent from the Spanish Habsburgs as offerings to foreign dignitaries. This collecting practice was, of course, part and parcel of the period fascination with marvels. While many of these human beings were seen as accidents of nature that could potentially undermine the social order, their presence at court also affirmed the preordained hierarchy, culminating in the figure of the king. And just like the principal figures within this hierarchy, these servants of the court would be immortalized in a number of group portraits or individual paintings by Diego Velázquez, including, of course, that most paradoxical of portraits of royal family, Las Meninas. Though in earlier inventories, this painting was sometimes referred to as La Familia, this composition, as we know, brings together a host of other characters beyond the royals, including two dwarfs, a female one identified as Mari Barbola, and a male one, the one standing next to the large dog, whose name was apparently Nicolas Pertusato. Now, the importance of these non-normative personages within the court structure was reflected also in the range of terms that were used to describe them. Some of them were identified simply as dwarfs, enanos, because of their diminutive forms and figures. Others, who might be ostensibly very similar, could also be referred as monstrous marvels of nature. There are also subcategories, of course, among the so-called fools or jesters. For instance, the terms locos and bobos, were usually reserved for natural fools. On the other hand, jesters could be described by a range of other words, including bufones, truhanes, or graciosos. And of course, there were a lot of overlaps between these categories. Some dwarfs or enanos could also be bufones, and those could be in turn either natural or artificial fools. Many of these servants enjoyed a kind of privileged status at court on account of their closeness with the principals, whereas the natural fools, people who suffered from different disabilities, were typically kept as an expression of aristocratic largesse and charity. The artificial fools could oftentimes hold official functions for which they received salaries. By and large, these artificial fools were a source of entertainment, but they could also sometimes provoke with their impudent comments and even risk punishment for their behavior. Their tendency to subvert codes and to disrespect authority, especially when they were engaged as actors, made them also more threatening to the entire idea of court hierarchy. When it comes to Velázquez's portraits, one can certainly see that there are remarkable examples of all of these types. On the one hand, we have images such as the Buffon with books, dated to about 1640. This painting immortalizes a dwarf whose serious gaze and demeanor belie the comic aspect of his diminutive figure. On the other hand, we have somebody like Juan Calabasias. He was certainly a natural fool, and he was probably just a lowly entertainer at the court. Such individuals, like Calabasias, were often brought, as we noted, from other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, and pretty frequently from lunatic asylums. They were treated with compassion, since their physical or mental characteristics were considered to be God-given. In addition, though many people saw them merely as a source of entertainment, for others they also embodied the cruelty of fortune. As one contemporary writer would observe, in a world full of madmen, the worst ones were those who pretended to be virtuous, yet refused to help such wretched souls. When it comes to the representation of these non-normative beings, historically, their portraits appear well before Velázquez's tenure at the court. In fact, the earliest independent portraits in this genre occur within decades after the first independent portraits of nobility. One notable example one could mention is Antony Smore's portrait of the favorite dwarf of one of the ministers of Charles V, Cardinal Granvelle. That is the painting dated to about 1560. This composition became a veritable prototype for many later ones, including the one known as Dwarf with a Dog. It is not firmly attributed or dated, but it is generally placed in the circle of Velázquez. Similarly, a painting such as this double portrait of Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia with Magdalena Ruiz by Alonso Sanchez Coello, which is dated to about 1580 to 1585 and is in the Prado, shows us essentially an aristocrat accompanied by a favorite dwarf and sets the tone for other images that are also in company of their servants. In this case, of course, we are talking about the precious young daughter of Philip II, and she's towering over her aged, trusted maid, who had been in service at the court since the time of Charles V. Though the diminutive form of this loyal companion has sometimes been explained as a function of her kneeling pose, the portrait leaves little, if any, doubt about the servant-master relationship. And the same is true of other compositions, including the one by Rodrigo de Viandrando, where we see Prince Philip with his dwarf Miguel Soplio. This one is dated to about 1620, also at the Prado. In both of these paintings, the aristocratic sitters rest their hands on their servants' heads, implying both benevolent subordination and protection. This attitude accords with the perceived duty of the nobles to extend their generosity towards these less able members of society. At the same time, this stance affirms their moral, physical, and intellectual superiority over these servants. El Soplio has finely proportioned body. He looks like a little noble child almost, and calls to mind similar images in other court settings. For instance, Anthony van Dyck's Henrietta Maria with her favorite dwarf, Sir Geoffrey Hudson. This one is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and dated to about 1634. Such diminutive human beings could earn admiration on account of their childlike appearance, as we know from written records about other similar characters within the Spanish setting. The most famous among them may be the male dwarf that was sent by the Archduchess Isabella to her brother Philip II. This male dwarf was nicknamed Bon-Ami. We also know of a very pretty female dwarf whose doll-like figure earned her the sobriquet Puppe. In contrast, there were misshapen dwarfs, such as the one portrayed by one of Velázquez's peers, Juan van der Amen. And of course, this painting, dated to about 1626, is also at the Prado. These people, these little dwarfs, were seen as pitiable yet comical creatures, akin to those that feature in caricatures from the time period. Van der Amen's sitter, possibly a dwarf nicknamed Bartolio, is a perfect example of the carnivalesque reversals that characterize a lot of these portraits. He is dressed in an ostentatious, expensive costume. He is also wielding something akin to a ruler's staff. In this sense, he provides a kind of anamorphic mirror of court ideals and expectations. The same can be said of the two portraits by Juan Carreño de Miranda of the child giant Eugenia Martinez Vallejo. Those are from around 1680, much later, also at the Prado. Like Van der Amen's Bartolio, these two portraits of a famous female monster, shown once nude and once in full finery, would have provided perfect prompts for conversations about the various disguises of the world, or that famous gap between the apparent and the real. Though Velázquez's portraits in this genre conform with all these conventions and ways of seeing, they also consistently challenge audience expectations. As writers have often emphasized, his sympathetic characterization of these varied personages transcends the cultural clichés about their roles at the court. Instead of reducing them to specific types, he focuses on what makes them human, more similar to ourselves. As a result, we become both more sensitive to their individuality and to the ways in which they relate to the portraits of the members of the royal family whom they were ordained to serve. It is precisely this emphasis on the humanity of his fools, dwarfs, and jesters that allows us to consider and question the ways in which we establish the difference between the beautiful and the misshapen, the base and the noble, the comical and the serious, ultimately folly and wisdom. At the same time, for all of his sensitivity to these sitters as individual persons rather than representatives of a type, Velázquez's portraits are also deeply informed by broader cultural concerns. What I have in mind in particular here is the dichotomy between semblance and being, or, in the Spanish context, the engaño and desengaño, the false appearances and the disillusioned gaze that allows us to grasp the substance of phenomena. Central to the intellectual discourse of the period, this preoccupation with the illusory nature of the world would find its most memorable expression in characters such as Cervantes's hapless knight fighting the figments of his imagination, or Calderon's Sigismundo, the noble prisoner who keeps moving from one dreamlike reality to another, never quite certain who he is and where he is. This dialectic between semblance and being gains additional dimensions in the portraits of dwarfs, fools, and jesters, as individuals who feel both eminently familiar and different, whether because of inborn characteristics or because of the roles they perform for the pleasure of their superiors. Now let us look more closely at one of Velázquez's earliest portraits in this genre, Don Balthazar Carlos with a Dwarf, a painting in Boston in the Museum of Fine Arts dated to about 1632. Here we see the toddler prince and heir to the Spanish throne with his favorite dwarf companion. They're seemingly engaged in child's play. Their placement within this composition clearly alludes to a hierarchical relationship as well, in much the same way as we saw in the double portraits by Coello and Villandrando of the aristocrats with their favorite dwarfs. At the same time, these human beings, as portrayed by Velázquez, the two of them, are patently similar in terms of their disproportionate figures, those large heads, those diminutive bodies weighted down by sumptuous dress, all these trappings of court life. The dwarf is holding an apple and a rattle. Those may be just innocent playthings for the prince, but one cannot help and relate them as props to Bartolio's staff. In other words, they can stand for the orb and the scepter of the future king. It is generally believed that this painting was created shortly after the nobles of Castile had sworn their allegiance to the 2-year-old heir to the throne. According to contemporary documents, during that ceremony, the toddler was dressed in this very fashion, as you see him in this portrait, complete with the sash, sword, and armored collar typically worn by a Spanish captain general. As for his dwarf companion, there is no consensus regarding his or her identity. This uncertainty may be part of the performative character of Velázquez's invention. Though the figure looks almost female, we may be seeing a male dwarf masquerading as a miniature concert for the future king. Such dress-up games would have been in line with the frequent use of gender ambiguity and disguise as comic devices in contemporary Spanish theater. This possibility also gains added support if one considers the physiognomic resemblance between the figure in this double portrait and the so-called portrait of Francisco Lescano, who was in fact a dwarf who had been given as a personal servant to Prince Balthazar Carlos, and we know him from one of Velázquez's most memorable portraits from this time period. Though the earliest records about Lescano at the court are from around 1634, which would be 2 years after the supposed dating of the double portrait from Boston, given the fragmentary nature of period documents, we cannot preclude the possibility that this favorite of Balthazar Carlos may have arrived a couple of years earlier. And Velázquez, by the way, portrayed him around 1634-35. That's the date of the portrait from the Prado of Francisco Lescano, and likely for the Royal Hunting Lodge of Torre de la Parada. He remained in service until his own death in 1649, which was only 3 years after the death of the 16-year-old prince himself. The physical proximity between this dwarf and his or her royal charge is usually interpreted as an allusion to the difficult choice between pleasure and duty for the young prince. Namely, Balthazar Carlos has to leave behind the games of childhood all too soon in order to assume his destined role as the ruler of the empire. While his physical affinity to his misshapen and gently amusing playmate may be baffling at first, that may well be the very point of their juxtaposition. For if the prince and the dwarf are so different from one another, why do they strike us as being almost indistinguishable? Is Velázquez playing on this visual resemblance between them in order to remind us of that all-important need for discernment, discretion, so crucial to the success of any courtier? Does that reminder perhaps lead us to an additional ironic analogy between the royal duty of good governance and children's games? Whatever the case may be, this double portrait is clearly an homage to the infant ruler as well as a fine courtly joke. It is both a pleasant distraction and another edifying mirror for the prince. Now, the same witty play of similes and contrasts will be present in other portraits by Velázquez from this period, such as, for instance, the buffon Juan de Austria and his counterpart, the buffon Barbaroja or Cristobal de Castañeda y Pernia. These two works, also in the Prado, are dated to about 1633-35, but we do not know with certainty when exactly they were painted and for what location. The one known as Juan de Austria, we know that that particular character, that jester or fool, served at the court since 1624. He was jokingly named after the illegitimate son of Philip II, who had distinguished himself by his heroic fighting of the enemies of Spain, especially at the Battle of Lepanto. The latter one, on the other hand, the so-called Barbaroja, was believed to have entered service in 1633. He was known for his impertinence and brashness. He was one of those dangerous fools. Here, he impersonates one of Spain's most famous adversaries from the recent past, the Grand Admiral of Suleiman the Magnificent, Hayreddin Barbarossa. These two portraits have always been seen as two halves of a larger symbolic unit. They are mentioned for the first time in a 1701 inventory from the Palace of Buen Retiro, together with several other images of fools. They were probably intended to hang right next to one another. This is supported by their similarities in terms of subject matter, format, and style, but also by the pointedly ironic nature of their assumed identities. As Javier Portus has observed, they, quote, constitute a paradoxical reflection of the sort Velázquez truly enjoyed about how history is carried out by disguising simple buffons as heroes. End quote. This, of course, accords with the court taste for conceptual games regarding, again, the dichotomy between semblance and being. Now, this is all about paradoxa, visual paradoxes, conceptual paradoxes, and there is a very marked taste for paradox in the literary and the visual culture alike. And when we speak about the prevalence of paradox in the culture of 17th century Spain, we oftentimes talk about certain socio-political realities, including the deepening political and dynastic crisis at the court, as well as the wider sense of irreversible decline of a once powerful empire. In this context, the portraits of Don Juan de Austria and Barbarossa have also been related to specific political and military challenges of the Spanish Empire, namely the Mantuan War, which was between 1628 and 1631, as well as the Franco-Spanish conflict that followed in its wake between 1631 and 35. Yet, at the same time, one cannot overlook the fact that the ironies of these two images fit in with an even broader humanist discourse on folly, reflecting the uncertainties arising from a number of other ideological upheavals during the early modern period. By Velázquez's time, the idea of universal folly had become a veritable cliché among the educated classes at various European courts. It was a cultural trope, and it had evolved from the medieval emphasis on the folly and vanity of every man to a much more encompassing metaphor for the human condition. Furthermore, the turn of Renaissance thinkers and writers towards the dialogue as a preferred mode of argumentation, with all of its inherent shifts in perspectives, registers, and voices, made firm conclusions regarding any proposition almost impossible. Within this dialogical framework, fools were often conceived as counterparts or alter egos of their principals. They served, they accompanied them everywhere. They are their reverse mirrors, so to speak. And this is exemplified, of course, by Sancho and Don Quixote, in the English context most famously by Falstaff and Prince Henry. This is also the same dialogical framework within which we have to see Velázquez's fools, including these two impersonators of the illegitimate hero Don Juan de Austria and the fearsome Ottoman admiral, respectively. As noted earlier, though the court jester could be interchangeable with the simpleton, one could never be sure if a person who was employed as a court jester was a natural fool or a clever pretender who got to speak freely by feigning imbecility. This ambiguity is very much at work in this pair of portraits as well. While we do not know for sure if the person posing as Juan de Austria was a natural fool, he certainly looks a lot more benign and naive than his partner in this dialogue. The angry Barbarossa, on the other hand, we know about this fool. He was definitely an artificial one, as indicated by numerous accounts regarding his impertinence, as well as his paid position as an emissary of the Cardinal Infante. In other words, he was much closer to other clever jesters recorded in service of the Spanish Habsburgs. These are characters such as Francesio de Zuniga and Estebanillo González, who were the favorite fools of Charles V and Cardinal Infante Don Fernando, respectively. So to go back to this dialogue between Velázquez's fool, between Don Juan and Barbaroja, essentially in this exchange what we see is the same problem that confronted us when we have to deal with the double portrait of Balthazar Carlos and his dwarf companion. How do we make a proper judgment on the basis of person's appearance and self-presentation? Velázquez is creating a guessing game. He's very fond of these guessing games, and it is only deepened by our awareness of the internal difference between these two performers. On the one hand, a real simpleton versus a sharp-witted jester who is feigning foolishness. This juxtaposition is essential to their dialogue, or perhaps one could use another term, their duel as two enemies from the past. By confronting a dimwit in the role of the illegitimate yet heroic prince with a would-be fool who is posing as a legendary enemy of the Spanish crown, Velázquez is underscoring the ironies of history as shaped by individual choices but also vagaries of fortune. The pairing of these fools would have gained additional valence from their display, both in relation to one another and with other portraits that probably hung nearby. Again, while we do not have a precise understanding of their original location, the 1701 inventory from Buen Retiro lists them very close to portraits of fellow fools and other human oddities. However, in view of Velázquez's tendency to engage the beholder with paradoxical propositions, one can imagine that these buffons would have also prompted consideration of their possible affinity to portraits of noblemen or members of the royal family. In other words, their placement in relative proximity to such portraits would have created yet another opportunity for the aristocratic beholders to contemplate the difference between reality and fiction. And in this process, they might even grasp the deeper message within these grotesque doubles of Don Juan de Austria and Barbaroja, namely, that all history is written by the victor, and that even these beholders, as members of the court, have very little control over the ways in which they might be remembered, represented, or forgotten. For if such historic personages are so easily recast as fools, would it be difficult to imagine even oneself as a subject of future mock-heroic homages of a similar kind? Like the double portrait of the toddler prince and his dwarf, this pictorial conversation between Don Juan and Barbaroja constitutes a concepto, conceit, which the great master of literary wit, Balthazar Gracian, would define as, quote, an act of understanding that expresses a correspondence between two objects or phenomena, end quote. In this case, that correspondence occurs at several levels. The relationship between a natural fool and an artificial one, their respective relationships to the historical characters they impersonate, as well as to their noble beholders, who are, by the way, mere actors in the great theater of the court. In addition, these two fools, playing in the role of these historical enemies, shed additional light actually on two later equally striking portraits of court servants, if you will, who can also be classified as fools of sorts. What I have in mind here are the full-length portraits of Aesop and Menipus, painted by Velázquez to complement the portraits of Heraclitus and Democritus that had been designed by Peter Paul Rubens for that royal hunting lodge Torre de la Parada. Rubens's choice of these ancient sages, Heraclitus and Democritus, was based on a long tradition of their representations in Renaissance palazzi and villas. They are best known from Juvenal's 10th satire. Heraclitus and Democritus, of course, stood for two contrasting and harmonizing ways of dealing with the universal folly. Heraclitus through endless lament, while Democritus through endless laughter. Now, in contrast, Velázquez's philosophers are barely acceptable as philosophers. Menipus is associated with the cynical school, but that entire school, if we can call it that, is famous for its nonconformity and idiosyncrasy. Aesop, on the other hand, cannot be associated with any philosophical school whatsoever, though the contrast between his misshapen body and beautiful mind would often be used as a point of comparison with, of course, the ugly yet sublimely wise Socrates. Menipus had a reputation as someone who did not take anything seriously, and in a way, because of that ironic tendency, he becomes a perfect match to Rubens's philosopher of laughter, Democritus. In addition, these philosophers correspond to one another temperamentally. Namely, Menipus, who is also known as rather angry and abrasive, stands for the choleric temper, versus Democritus, who is so jovial and bubbly, and he stands for the sanguine temper. Similarly, Aesop was often described as phlegmatic, and he's often spoken of in those terms, and he would have made a very fitting counterpart to the melancholy Heraclitus. Now, we believe that Rubens painted Heraclitus and Democritus somewhere between 1636-38, and Velázquez added Menipus and Aesop sometime thereafter. Again, we do not know when exactly. But whereas Rubens's philosophers look their part, Menipus and Aesop, of course, evoke characters living on the margins of society. This outsider quality accords with their reputation as debunkers of human pretensions. They're also, both of them, are known for their willingness to speak truth to power and pay high price for their impertinence. Most importantly for our present discussion of fools at the court, both Menipus and Aesop begin their lives as slaves, servants, who earn their freedom by the power of their wits. Notwithstanding the popularity of the beggar philosopher as a type during this period, this is yet another of Velázquez's witty responses to Rubens's proper and dignified sages. By setting up his poor philosophers, outcasts, as mirrors of the wise men painted by his older contemporary, he is once again presenting the beholder with a guessing game about the relationship between appearances and reality. You look at them and you ask yourself questions. Which of these four men is a philosopher? Which one is an impostor? Which one is noble? Which one is foolish? Is somebody a jester in here? Do appearances deceive us even more than we imagine? Moreover, by making this highly unorthodox choice of thinkers from antiquity to address human folly, the young and ambitious Spanish painter is also challenging the authority of Peter Paul Rubens, whose renown was unrivaled at this point of his career. Rubens had brought to the Royal Hunting Lodge two well-rehearsed characters whose message about moderation and avoidance of extremes had been played out in countless other court settings. Velázquez's anti-philosophers, on the other hand, constitute a mockery of anything you can call conventional philosophy. It's almost a gesture comparable to the ways in which a fool might parody a courtier or even a prince. Seeing Aesop and Menipus in this light, Velázquez's pictorial repartee to that most princely of painters, Sir Peter Paul Rubens, compares, in a sense, as a strategy, as a visual strategy, to the agudezza one might associate with a particularly clever jester. Yet ultimately, the target of his irony is not his fellow artist, but the courtiers whom he seduces into this fourfold conversation on wisdom and folly. Velázquez is fond of jesting, as we can see from so many other examples of pointedly ironic paintings from throughout his career. But these jests have nothing to do with the buffoonery and crude humor of the so-called truhanes. Within the culture of courtly joke, his pictorial concepti are much closer to the verbal performances of the jesters that were usually described as graciosi. This term, by the way, deriving from contemporary Spanish comedies, is typically used for characters that are very skillful in wordplay, able to speak the truth without offending, which also explains why this term was also applied to the manners of courtiers. In the sense of this term, gracioso also relates to the qualities of gracia or graciosidade, and this was, of course, praised in many manuals on court behavior, especially after Boscan's 1534 translation of the Book of the Courtier by Baltasar Castiglione. Indeed, for some of the Spanish authors of these manuals, such as Diego de Saavedra Fajardo and Luis Milan, gracia and cortesia were used for verbal exchanges that could include witty but tasteful jesting, unlike the crass jokes and clowning associated with those truhanes, chocareros, or ordinary buffoni. The character of gracioso could also have a therapeutic function. One of the best-known graciosi of this kind was the court doctor Francesco de Villalobos, lived between 1473 and 1549. He earned the epithet El Mayor Burlador de Castile on account of his use of humor as a way of distracting his patients from the sensation of pain. According to an anecdote related by the jester and chronicler of Charles V, Francesio de Zuniga, this Dr. Villalobos could also be quite impertinent towards his superiors. Thus, when the king made a comment about his excessive humor on one occasion, Villalobos apparently replied in the following manner, quote, "Would your grace please teach me how to be a fool, since you are an authority, and I will stop being a gracioso." So Menipus and Aesop in some ways are graciosi as well, especially vis-a-vis Rubens's conventional sages. As slaves who become free men through their wits, these ragtag personages are also disruptors, be it in terms of philosophical dogma or court hierarchy. Menipus will famously deride philosophers because of their endless disagreements. He actually will propose that the best way of life is that of the humble, ordinary man. Similarly, Aesop is purchased at a market by a philosopher, interestingly enough, Xanthus, for a very low price. Why? Because he is deemed almost worthless because of his ugly exterior. Yet soon enough, his new master Xanthus learns that he has acquired a very special, if not dangerous, servant, because he becomes constant target of Aesopus and his satiric jesting. Within the court setting, fooling is always a performance, a form of deception that makes observers aware of their own roles in the great theater of the world. At the same time, through their complex games of dissimulation and double talk, jesters consistently undermine the boundaries between performer and observer, the counterfeit and the real. This ability to show the falsity of appearances and encourage speculation can be conveyed through a variety of attributes. Sometimes you will see a jester with a pair of spectacles, another times with a little mirror speculum, or a miniature self-portrait on top of a jester's staff, as another sly gesture of mockery, both of oneself and the beholder. Fools are always seen as performers on court stages, and those court stages are in turn mirrors of the Theatrum Mundi. This idea, popularized by thinkers like Erasmus and many others, will be endlessly rehearsed in the Spanish context. Thus, in one of the allegorical plays of Calderón de la Barca, the great theater of the world, we find the world as a character who delivers a monologue about the human predicament. And what the world tells us, that men can only act in obedience to their parts, or the roles that have been imposed upon them. As Shakespeare famously reminds us, through his disillusioned King Lear, this world theater is, quote, one great stage of fools, end quote. And as his compatriot Robert Burton will add in his treatise on melancholy, this theater of the world requires not one, but many philosophers like Democritus, since the whole world plays the fool, as he says, in a new comedy of errors, where all the actors are madmen and fools. They simply change their habits continuously as they shift from one ridiculous role to another. So consider how these commonplaces, we find them in Spanish theater, we find them in England, we find them in France. Consider how these commonplaces would resonate as one walked through the rooms of a palace, decorated with rows of portraits of individuals worthy of being committed to memory, and how disorienting this experience would become upon encountering fools and human oddities next to those memorable individuals. The toddler Balthazar Carlos, future ruler of the empire, barely distinguishable from his dwarf, or a dim-witted fool in the role of the illegitimate prince Don Juan de Austria, next to the clever fool impersonating one of the great enemies of the empire, and so on and so forth. All of these portraits, as well as many other paintings by Velázquez, where he juxtaposes personages in different roles, constitute another world theater that necessitates a constant shift in perspectives and points of view. Again, that quality of discernment, discretion, which is essential for navigating a court environment notorious for double talk, dissimulation, and intrigue. This notion of discretion, in turn, encompasses a host of qualities, including that sharpness of wit, agudeza, ingenuity, ingenio, but also judgment, judicio, and good sense, cordura. These are also the qualities that Velázquez demands from the viewers of his portraits, or that somebody like Balthazar Gracián expects from the readers of his popular aphorisms. Indeed, the way in which Velázquez conveys the paradoxical messages of his paintings compares to the manner in which this master of literary wit captures the reader's thoughts when he observes in one of his aphorisms that, quote, "They're all fools who seem so, as well as half the rest." Or when he adds in another aphorism that, quote, "Though all the world is full of fools, there is no one who thinks himself one or even suspects the fact." End quote. So, like Gracián's verbal performances and paradoxes, Velázquez's pictorial conversations have an element of sophistry. At the same time, they also possess what we can call Socratic simplicity, the simplicity that we see in that underlying humanity of his subjects, despite their various masks and roles, either chosen or imposed upon them. Using a visual language that compares in terms of its wit to the rhetorical agudeza associated with writers like Gracián, Velázquez illuminates correspondences between different entities within the hierarchy of being, in order to make us return repeatedly to fundamental questions. How do we know what we are seeing? How do we establish any hierarchy? In the portrait of Balthazar Carlos and his dwarf, we recognize the unity of unlikely opposites. One can describe it as a form of that Renaissance idea of discordia concours. And of course, this is accomplished through the proximity, the juxtaposition between these same but different characters. With the fools posing as Don Juan de Austria and Barbaroja, who seem both exceedingly real and patently preposterous, we learn to appreciate the unstable meaning of phenomena as we contemplate the layers of fiction within these two personages. In this sense, it is interesting to consider if the fool impersonating the heroic illegitimate prince may also have served as the model for that most paradoxical Mars, painted by Velázquez within several years after these compositions, possibly also for Torre de la Parada. If you look at the two of them, their facial features are similar enough to allow for that possibility. And so does the fact that in both paintings, Velázquez is essentially creating a portrait of a foolish warrior, literally and metaphorically. Could there be some kind of ironic comment in here in both paintings? Perhaps about the folly of war? Or even more pointedly, could he be referring to foolish leaders who cause disasters for their subjects through their godlike presumptions? This kind of sentiment would have certainly felt relevant at this troubled moment for the empire, given the endless twists and turns within the 30 Years' War. And this was certainly felt by Gracián, especially as he later on wrote and published his allegorical masterpiece, El Criticón. In this novel, at one point we find the naive protagonist, Andrenio. He arrives at the main plaza of the universe, and that's where he encounters mobs of noisy fools engaged in wars, bad governance, and idle bickering. Frightened by the monstrous vulgacho, vulgacho stands for the ugly mob itself, Andrenio desperately attempts to return to his companion Critillo. Critillo symbolizes maturity and the ability to see through the surfaces of things. In a sense, Critilo is Andrenio's friend and counterpart, the intellectual versus the emotional response to reality, or spiritual versus corporeal, as he has also been interpreted. These two characters also function as antithetical and complementary mirrors, in much the same way in which Don Juan talks to Barbaroja, or Menipus converses with Aesop, or the way in which Menipus and Aesop together respond to Rubens's Heraclitus and Democritus. But what about the portraits of fools that do not seem to have clear counterparts, other than the beholder? This is the case, for example, with Pablo de Valladolid. He is another fool who is known to have been in service at the court since 1632. His wonderful portrait by Velázquez is usually dated around 1635, but it may have been created slightly earlier as part of the decorations for the Buen Retiro. Now, this assumption is also based on the fact that Pablo de Valladolid, this portrait, is mentioned in that same inventory of 1701 in Buen Retiro. Though this character is not a professional actor, his pose and gesture clearly allude to acting and performance, which makes him another kin or relative of sorts to Don Juan and Barbaroja. And of course, the idea of role-playing becomes even more intriguing if we accept the oft-mentioned possibility in the literature that Pablo de Valladolid was also the model for a figure typically identified as Democritus. This painting by Velázquez is datable to around 1630, maybe 1632. In this case, we have no Heraclitus, which may be due to a loss of a painting, or perhaps Velázquez decided not to paint the crying philosopher in the first place. Perhaps this omission was a conscious choice, showing his partiality for Democritus, the philosopher of laughter. This would have been very much in line with the preference of many other humanist thinkers, from Erasmus to Robert Burton. Or perhaps Velázquez's choice just of Democritus reflected the ironic sensibility of his patron, whoever that patron may have been. Unfortunately, we do not know. However, it's still important to consider this painting in the context of the discussion of these fools and servants of the court. As most other images of Democritus from the early modern era, this character smiles towards us as he points to the globe. And what's really comical in this instance is this is an actual wooden ball on a stand that looks rather like a toy. For Fernando Bouza, the paltry size of the globe in this and other pictorial representations of Democritus seems to suggest a Senecan distancing of the self from the insignificance of worldly concerns. For another scholar, Berzal de Dios, this concrete globe also carries a pointed political message. The angle from which we see the sphere, which is essentially literally there in front of our eyes, is also casting the so-called empire on which the sun never sets in a deep shadow of illegibility, as Berzal de Dios has suggested. Most importantly, both this character in contemporary attire and the patently physical wooden sphere remind us that what we are looking at is another game of make-believe. As usual, Velázquez is pushing his beholders back and forth between things as they appear to the eye and their metaphorical meanings, in much the same way as he did it in the portrait of Baltasar Carlos with his dwarf, or with the natural and artificial fools acting as famous historic characters. Like anamorphic mirrors, these paintings require us to adjust our point of view until we can get a proper perspective on the visual riddle. The problem is we are never really certain what the correct image is supposed to be. Instead, our judgment remains suspended between two equally possible ways of seeing, which is in itself essential to the manifold ironies of this pictorial concetti. The closest parallel to these puzzling visual constructions in the literary culture of the period is the Menippean satire. This is a genre characterized by joyful relativism that consistently destabilizes the reader's sense of understanding. And it is quite popular in Spain. The best-known examples among earlier Spanish writers may be the Somnium of 1520 by Juan Luis Vives and Alfonso de Valdes's dialogue between Mercury and Charon from 1529. The Menippean satire is of course behind some other literary constructions closer to Velázquez's time. In this context, of course, Cervantes is the most famous one, both with his exemplary tales and especially with Don Quixote, but one could also mention Lope de Vega, Quevedo, and even Gracian. What characterizes the Menippean satire? It destabilizes readers' expectations consistently. As Howard Weinbrod will eloquently observe, quote, "It is a precarious universe of broken and fragile national, cultural, religious, political, or generally intellectual values. This is the universe of the Menippean satire. And this alone would have made it eminently appropriate for the Habsburg court of Velázquez's time. For all of their individual differences, the Spanish followers of Menipus in the literary culture repeatedly returned to one overarching theme: the difference between what people profess and their actions, between their self-representation and their inner selves. Thus, in Quevedo's World Inside Out, El Mundo por de Dentro, we find the protagonist lost at the main street of the world. When he asks about the name of the street, his guide tells him that it is, quote, hypocrisy, which, quote, begins and ends in the world, and there is scarcely anyone who doesn't have, if not a house, then at least rooms or temporary lodgings along the length of it, end quote. Needless to say, the name of the guide is Desengaño. In Covarrubias's dictionary of 1611, hypocrisia is defined as misrepresentation, or the act of showing on the outside something contrary to what is inside, while hypocrita is someone who dissimulates or does things contrary to what he professes, the way orators do that at times. Of course, these words, Covarrubias also explains, relate to the original Greek usage of hypocrites for an actor who performs a role or elucidates the meaning of a story. It also has all those negative connotations, both in the context of oratory or politics. So that same preoccupation with hypocrisy is central to the character of Menipus. For example, in one of Lucian's dialogues that were so popular throughout this period, Menipus decides to create wings for himself and fly over the world so as to be able to behold it in its totality. Now, unlike the craftsman Daedalus, who fashions wings and glues them with feathers and wax, Menipus simply takes 2 wings from a dead vulture and attaches them to his shoulders. And yet, despite this preposterous flying mechanism, he manages to soar above the world. And what he beholds is that same universal human folly in endless variations. Human contradictions, human hypocrisy in endless variations. So when you look at somebody like Pablo de Valladolid, you have to call him hypocrita. By definition, he is a court fool whose capacity to play many different roles reminds us of the role playing also among his imaginary interlocutors, the nobles that would look at him, but also the role playing among present day beholders. Like most of Velázquez's characters, Pablo de Valladolid is a creature of contradictions. He is a fool who seems as dignified as a nobleman, a sharp-witted impersonator who is capable of shifting between different theatrical roles at will, and yet he is never able to transcend his preordained role as a court servant. Captured on this canvas by Velázquez from life, looking so alive, he is both persuasive presence and an illusion, and thus another perfect test for the courtier's discretion. As for the painter who presents this hypocrita to our eyes, one can certainly compare him to a Manichaean satirist in his refusal to maintain the illusions that govern his theater of images. For as soon as we are seduced by one of his artifices, he dispels it as a game of make-believe, where, as Gratian would say, things pass for what they seem rather than what they are. The only way out of his intellectual and pictorial puzzles may be to live to learn with their multiplicity. If we cannot unpack the layers within an image, we can at least recognize the need for continuous adjustments of our points of view, and by extension, for continuous accommodation to our own roles. Indeed, to insist on a closure within Velázquez's visual games with fools may be the ultimate wrong approach. These games are by definition open-ended. After all, to go back to Gratian once again, as he will remind his readers, quote, "To die of the fool's disease is to die of too much thought, since in the end, one half of the world laughs at the other, and fools are they all." End quote. Thank you.